I'm Todd Gitlin. I teach at Columbia University. I formerly taught at UC Berkeley. I'm speaking here about the breakup of American Jewish identity and its quandaries, and I hope it is a good experience for all of us.
Thank you all for coming out. I am Claude Fisher, professor of sociology at Berkeley and also a member of the board of the Center for Jewish Studies. And this event is being sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies on campus, which is involved in a number of activities, including education for undergraduates and providing further advanced education in Jewish studies for graduate students, and putting on a number of events such as this one. And we welcome you to the Center for Jewish Studies evening. You'll find on your seats cards with information about the center and a request, if you could, to help support the center in our activities. Thank you. So today we are honored to hear from Professor Todd Gitlin on the subject of Jewish identity. The formal description or introduction of Professor Gitlin goes as follows. He is a professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the PhD program in communications at Columbia University. Todd has written 16 books, one of which, co-authored with Liel Leibowitz, touches on the subject of today's talk, The Chosen Peoples, America, Israel, and the Ordeals of Divine Election. And I'll just say parenthetically, I read that book closely, and I've used it, and it has some very interesting insights about the parallels between Israeli ideology and American ideology. Todd is also a member of the editorial board of Dissent, a board member of Partners for Progressive Israel, and for Tablet, the online Jewish magazine. His novel, Sacrifice, won the Harold Raballo Award for Fiction on Jewish themes. And his latest forthcoming book is another novel called The Opposition. Now that's for the formal introduction. There's a lot more behind that I know about because Todd and I were colleagues at Berkeley a few decades ago. Before graduate school, Todd was a leader of the New Left in the United States and later documented the history of the New Left. He got a PhD in the UC Berkeley Sociology Department and became a member of the faculty at UC Berkeley Sociology. Todd then moved to NYU and later to Columbia, and where in New York he became a novelist and a major public intellectual. One of the interesting things in following Todd's career is the extent to which he has turned to Jewish topics increasingly in recent years, and we've had some correspondence on those topics in the last several years. The topic he's going to talk about, Jewish identity, is a perennial topic for Jews. Who is a Jew? Why is a Jew? Where is a Jew? But the important thing is that as perennial as that topic is, each era brings different challenges and different perspectives to that perennial question. And that's what we're going to learn about from Professor Todd Gitlin. Thank you.
Well, when last I saw this podium, my text was sitting on it. This was a test of my improvisational prowess, which I would fail. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Berkeley and among friends and colleagues and those who are not yet. So, with no further ado, dissension among Jews is nothing new. Neither are incomprehensible commands, harsh words, or ferocious faction fights. God tells Abram to abandon his father's house. Genesis does not record what his father thought, or, not surprisingly, his mother. The Almighty had not yet gotten around to the command to honor one's father and mother. Abram become Abraham, in turn, was not the kindest or gentlest of fathers. Sigismund Shlomo Freud, to use his birth name, ducked the intellectual problem of fathers and sons by centering on the Oedipus, not the Laius complex. There was also, if memory serves, some rather bad blood between the sons of Isaac. At a time when some Jews think to proclaim their Jewishness by telling other Jews that the proof of loyalty is to shut up. It bears remembering that the Jews are as quarrelsome as we are, in the words of the Bible, stiff-necked. Dissension is ancestral and recurrent. Sometimes, in fact, we take pride in it, as we should. We delight in the story about the Jewish Robinson Crusoe who builds 2 synagogues, and when asked why, explains that one of them he attends and the other he wouldn't set foot in. Unity among the Jews is no more common than unity among the Americans. Alongside the Reform, the Orthodox, the Conservative, and the Haredi, there have always been Jews who felt ill at ease or worse in one or another or all of those. I had a great uncle in an otherwise quite Orthodox family who wouldn't step into the synagogue to attend his son's wedding. He was, by the way, a socialist and an atheist who made the only fortune anyone in my family ever made, but I digress. High-stakes divisions cannot be overcome by schmaltz or even by paranoia. It won't do to rely upon a swastika spray-painted on a synagogue wall to remind us of our commonality. It's hollow and passive, though, to turn to one's enemies for definition. Anyway, not even the enemies of the Jews can agree on what makes us hateful. Neither will it do to smother arguments in the blue and white flag of a Jewish state. What it means to be Jewish is for Jews to say. At bottom, to be Jewish is to feel Jewish, in public and private. The truth within the overhanging haze of identity politics is that identity is lived from the inside. Identity imposed is a colonial imposition. So it's a good starting point to say that the tribe is made up of those who identify as members of the tribe. It matters not only to say so, but to feel so. It means something deep when we identify as Jews, even if we're not sure what we mean, whether we are a people or a nation or a religion or, as we tend to say today, a faith or a tradition. All of these definitions leave it to the Jews to define the Jews. Perhaps the chief exception is to agree with the chief rabbinate of Israel that not our consciousness but our chromosomes shall decide, that we are a gene pool marching around in human guise. Speaking of which, decades ago there was a joke that made the rounds about Barry Goldwater, the grandson of a Jewish immigrant, who wanted to play golf at a Phoenix country club where he was told with an apology that he wasn't welcome. Goldwater said to have said, "Well, that's all right, I only wanted to play 9 holes." I didn't know Barry Goldwater had a sense of humor. When I speak of divergences, tensions, and clashes as normal, I mean more than the time-worn, shop-worn notion of 2 Jews, 3 opinions. For there are among us and between us differences as well as commonalities that, however complicated and sometimes diffuse, plunge far deeper than opinions, least of all the opinions expressed to pollsters. They go to the heart of the matter, to where we live and what and how we feel, to the structure of feeling and the prize of self-knowledge that we have come to think of as identity. It is in this core, I think, that tensions are deepening into chasms. In one way, it should not be surprising, because American Jews come in more varieties than Ben and Jerry's, including, for that matter, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield, but also Barry Goldwater's grandfather and Bernie Sanders of the tribe of non-Jewish Jews, and also Joe Lieberman, Henry Kissinger, Sheldon Adelson, Jerry's Lewis and Seinfeld, Alan's Dershowitz and Woody, or the Kushners, the daughter and son-in-law of Donald Trump. All in all, we are a wild tribe that suffers from and exults in a surplus of history, a welter of metamorphoses, collisions, confusions, birthrights, and identity crises. But now we are back again to the definitional problem. My approach to clarity on this is to go to the ambiguous side, or to put it more high-mindedly, to turn to Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblances. The Jews, in other words, compose what he called a complicated network of similarities, overlapping, and crisscrossing. There are, in the case of the Jews, as Wittgenstein said, overall similarities. And he went on, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. I should clarify, Wittgenstein was not talking about Jews in particular. He was talking about members of an ill-defined category of any kind. So all manner of qualities and boundaries are stirred together in that, etc., doctrinal, institutional, legal, textual, ritual, national, and whatnot. Seen from within or without, there are resemblances, but not identity. Curious then, and interesting, that it should be hazy, the concept should be hazy at the boundary. It is not irrelevant that Wittgenstein was himself baffled about being a Jew. 3 of his 4 grandparents were Jewish, but one of them, his paternal grandfather, born Moses Meyer, became a Protestant and changed his middle name to Christian. This might be a biographical route for his interest in family resemblances. The genealogy of Jewish identity as a problem is ancient. It can't be denied that for centuries, the complicated network of the Jewish condition was and continues to be channeled through an overlapping obsession with a story contained in a book, by identification with it, as in the people of the book, and by constant contestation within it, with the effort to know, cherish, and preserve that book, and to honor those who take it seriously, to recite, decipher, and dispute it, to try to manage its contradictions, to honor the chain of commitments and sacrifices described there, to use chapters and verses of that book against other chapters and verses, aspiring always to make sense of a world full of absence, in which the one certainty about life is that it ends. The most important activity of an honorable Jew was to study the book which told the story of a tribe that was anointed as God's deputies on earth, along with the sanctioned commentaries on it. The people of Abraham, known as father of many, found a benefit, or at least a relief, to confront or evade radical mysteries of their existence in the company of a tribe equipped with, if nothing else, a common vocabulary, a story. The Jews had a story that featured them. There was convergence on that story as the story, concerning a unique and immensely powerful deity who created the world and flooded it to punish a failed species, saving only the line of Noah, a uniquely just man, and who later appeared to an otherwise undistinguished descendant of Noah called Abram, and spoke to him and set him toward a destination in Canaan, otherwise undistinguished as well, and set him on his journeys and his tasks, and arranged for an endpoint in a land whose meaning to them derived strictly from the fact that it had been designated by God. As you know, a great deal ensued, including rituals, miracles, enemies, exiles, escapes, the delivery of commandments and the setting of laws, and eventually defeat and centuries of diaspora, vastly longer than the duration of the Jewish state. And further on, throughout all the failures and defeats, the punishments meted out for their failures to do well by their assignments, millennial yearnings for a return to the Holy Land. Even Jews who disdained any foothold in the varieties of doctrinal Judaism felt the calling to locate themselves on a map whose once and enduring center was in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was what you had a relationship to, even if that relationship was mysterious, abstract, and hypothetical, even hostile. The language of Jewish longing for a surpassing, redeeming deliverance was saturated with a hunger for Zion, even in the breasts of Jews who were not Zionists. The Jews were the beneficiaries of a particular kind of story. It was not just a narrative of characters and events of the form A did X to B upon which C happened. It was not a story prescribed for a self-contained tribe. It was a morality tale that traced variations on an overpowering theme. A single God chose a single man to engender a singular people. Here's what happened when they tried to live up to their mission: tried and failed, tried, failed, and tried again. In the Jews' story, The age of gods in the plural was now to be overshadowed, and the age of God, singular, had arrived. The designated people told a story about themselves in which their story was central, because the single God whom they recognized, different from all the gods who were of surpassing value to all other peoples, determined that they should matter because he had chosen them, and not to be gods, but to be the people of the single God. The single God, as they understood him, was not only their God, the local God of their tribe, but the God, God in the singular, everyone's God, whether they knew it or not. So a universalist claim is built into the history of the Jews. God hammers it home when he addresses all the Jews in the world from Mount Sinai, after finally delivering them from bondage. The Jews are a particular people charged with universal significance. If you like that paradox, you like the Jews. The covenant declares a mission that exists not only for God and the Jews, but for the others, as it is written in Genesis 12:3, and I quote, "By you shall all families of the earth be blessed." All families of the earth. There were others, that is, Goyim, Ausländer, to contend with. In a word, the Jews were designated a people among peoples with a particular mission and task, Jewish exceptionalism, to be for themselves in the name of being for others, and for others in the name of being themselves. Not to be a people, but the people in behalf of the people. The logic was circular but weirdly compelling, as it was also perplexing to the people whom God had singled out. The story mattered because the single God must have known that there were other peoples holding to other gods. The Talmudic story of the young Abraham smashing idols makes the destruction of those idols a proof of his virtue, in fact, a story omitted in Genesis itself. The idea of chosenness was not unique to the Israelites. But unlike other people's parallel claims, it persisted even as the meaning of chosenness proved elusive and even obscure. It was the inescapable magnet for Jewish identity, and perhaps for this reason, it had the probably unintended effect of provoking a zero-sum challenge to all the peoples left unchosen. As Liel Leibovitz and I wrote in The Chosen Peoples, and I quote, "The Promised Land's native inhabitants struggled against a theology that declared them to be, in effect, the children of a lesser God. When they resisted becoming history's beautiful losers, they construed their defeats as martyrdom, built identities around humiliation, set out to regenerate themselves through acts of magic and will, and began to rationalize the next war." Close quote. The later Abrahamic religions developed their own forms of either-or chosenness, and they too recognized the power of the idea of the universal in the particular. Even toward the end of the 20th century, 50% of a national sample of American Jews conducted by the sociologist Stephen M. Cohen said they agreed with the statement, "Jews are a chosen people." Breaking out of the ghetto in the 18th century, the Jewish Enlightenment altered, widened, and complicated the scope of Jewish ideals. Some Jews who entered the outside world, in Stephen Cohen's words, universalized what had been a particularist civilization. But it was a particularist civilization with a difference. They would take up the Hebrew language, but they would also sign up with ways to belong to nations. For these Jews, there was not only an opportunity, but an imperative to return to one or another version of the divine election that stemmed from their origin, to open the Jews into broader Enlightenment currents of thought, to enlarge and in part secularize Jewish education, to make the Jew a citizen of the world, equipped or saddled with ethical obligations, even to point the way for them. A universalist tendency had long been latent in the cloistered Judaism of Europe. Now, let free, it could flourish. What was good for the Jews, in the thinking of the Jewish Enlightenment, would be to complete Hillel's triad, to be for ourselves, to be for others, and to be all that now. In other words, the Jews in the diaspora were to be a people of ethics. Exiles did not cease, and new homelands were founded. Under pressure, many European Jews flocked to varieties of the secular left, and then eventually, under the pressure of oppression, to Zionism, which, although ostensibly secular, carried in its bones a millennial spirit of return to the biblical homeland. In America, Jews went to work founding, to use the words of an ad in the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago for an Upper East Side condominium complex, and I quote, "a new tradition." New traditions, actually, in the plural, and quarrels among those traditions, both religious and secular, perched uneasily on the foundations of older traditions. In the historical land of Israel, as Leibovitz and I wrote, quoting again, undercurrents of chosenness rattled the ground. Even as Zionists fiercely disputed all manner of things, including the nature of a Jewish state and what policies to pursue, a spirit, one might even say a dybbuk, of chosenness inhabited them and continues to do so. But in America, the old question came to the surface again, chosen for what? A good part of the answer would become chosen for success. Jews were acculturated into a pot for partial melting, but also chosen to stand for justice, to complete Hillel's triad. It was another turn of the screw of ironic history that the Holocaust, as it came to be called, should have opened up American society for Jews. Barriers fell. Anti-Semitism withered, both the gentile type and the murderous type. Restrictive covenants were banned by the Supreme Court in 1948. University quotas were phased out. Turn-of-the-century Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe could join in the American celebration and give over their hearts to the newly founded Israel, even as their children were retreating from Yiddishkeit. Even as the Holocaust left us reeling, Jews overwhelmingly joined in a combination of redemptive spirit, old country nostalgia, and successful assimilation. Rituals of religious observance, holidays, and food cleared for acceptance by dietary laws that were held to be inscribed with the imprimatur of God. The grandchildren, like myself, found ourselves freed for secular lives, infused with what we thought of as Jewish values. This is a story for another day. Even as religious connections thinned out, Jews attend religious services at much lower rates than other American religious denominations. The Jews, at least in America, became a people of ethics. In Stephen Cohen's words, Jews are ethnically hyperactive and religiously indolent. Close quote. I would say also ethically hyperactive. But here was yet another turn of the screw. The Holocaust now became a badge of Jewish identity. Whatever you thought about the Jews being chosen by God, our people had been singled out for the worst assaults ever delivered upon a whole people in modern history. A Christian might say that the Jews were crucified. And to have suffered this crucifixion vicariously, to feel forever scarred by it, became a badge of identity. As the aforementioned Stephen Cohen wrote about a survey he did in 1989, quoting, "The Holocaust is more important to more respondents than any other symbol of Jewishness. As many as 85% say it is at least very important, and 56% call it extremely important. Both figures exceed comparable rates for all other concepts in the series that were tried out on the subjects of this survey. For example, the High Holies, an attachment to Israel, God, the Torah, all of them. Holocaust came in number one. The Holocaust, of course, was the ultimate denial of equality, of dignity, of justice. And if anything, it only elevated the significance of the affirmative values that had been so atrociously annihilated by Nazi Germany. As the Holocaust became more central to the Jewish imagination, so did the ethical core of being Jewish, a commitment to equality, dignity, justice. So it is that the liberalism of American Jews has withstood decades of disillusion. It should not be surprising, as Judge Richard Posner observed recently in the Washington Post, quoting, "The three liberal justices besides Sotomayor are Jewish," though, as he quickly added, they are not, it seems, influenced by Judaism in their judicial work. Well, it all depends what you mean, I suppose. Not by Judaic doctrine, but by the penumbra of egalitarian ethics that to most American Jews feels like their birthright. So what does Jewishness mean today in America? Is there a core, an essential overlap in the thick of all the family resemblances? So if we look at other social surveys, a quarter century after Stephen Cohen's, for example, you find in 2012, the Public Religion Research Institute found that 87% of American Jews said the Holocaust was, quote, somewhat or very important for informing their political beliefs and activity. Nearly half, 46% of American Jews cited a commitment to social equality as most important to their Jewish identity. Twice as many as cited support for Israel, which is 20%, or religious observance, 17%. 2013, a Pew poll found that U.S. Jews see being Jewish as more a matter of ancestry, culture, and values than of religious observance. 6 in 10 say, for example, that being Jewish is mainly a matter of culture or ancestry, compared with 15% who say it is mainly a matter of religion. Roughly 7 in 10 say remembering the Holocaust and leading an ethical life are essential to what it means to them to be Jewish, while far fewer say observing Jewish law is a central component of their Jewish identity. And 2/3 of Jews say that a person can be Jewish even if he or she does not believe in God. The view that remembering the Holocaust is essential to what it means to be Jewish is shared by majorities in all of the large Jewish denominational groupings. As Hitler's movement had chosen the Jews for annihilation, the Jews could now choose themselves, not only as survivors, but as redeemers. But what if there is no consensus on what it means to live an ethical life? What if a chasm divides the values of American Jews, diaspora Jews, from the Jews of the Jewish state? Between 1948 and 1967, American Jews could cherish the state of Israel on both particularist and universalist grounds. Israel was the state of the Jews, for sure. It had a part to play in the great universalism of nationhood, but it also leaned socialist. It could be exhibited as a case study of national liberation, and was frequently. Palestinians had no reality to the great majority of American Jews, but the Israeli victory of 1947-48 served both particularist and universalist needs. The Jews of the liberal left were doubly blessed. Be it old Jerusalem or new, Holy Land or God-fearing America as a city on a hill, the exalted state located elsewhere had long been, for the diaspora, a badge of identity, a palpable sign that history has a vector and a promise of renewal. Pride in the survival, or indeed the triumph, of the Jewish state evoked a general pride. The Israeli victory in the Six-Day War for a while re-cemented the salience of the Holocaust. David had crushed Goliath, but in the conquest of the territories lay demon seeds. The statehood of Israel had the sanction of international law. It still does. But when Israel became an illegal occupier of the West Bank, it forfeited its universalist mantle. It made Israel look less compelling an answer to the immense question of what might be left of chosenness. And what happened here is a dovetailing of the problem of what meaning might be found in the Holocaust with the problem of what to do in the victory of 1967. First, under center-left labor governments, and more radically under the Likud, Israel interpreted chosenness as a title to land and a warrant for defying world opinion and international law. It justified its aggressions as defenses. But this was an almost fatal mistake. Israeli exceptionalism abandoned the high moral ground. Gripped by messianism and a volatile brew of desperation and truculence, Israel defies the hard-fought achievements of the diaspora as it becomes steadily more illiberal, and thus more offensive to Jews who remain among America's most liberal populations. In a world of sinful nations, Israel now simultaneously claims the privilege of victimhood and the right to be honored as a democracy as it abandons liberality. This is a hell of a climb down from tikkun olam, the injunction of repairing the world and welcoming the stranger. It offers little solace or cohesion for American Jews. For the built-in ambiguities that face all minorities in America, Israel is no spiritual refuge. By now, a growing minority of younger American Jews are so intensely angry at the actually existing, increasingly illiberal Israel, which is no longer the Israel of Martin Buber and Paul Newman, as to reject Zionism as a dirty word and endorse the whole bundle of so-called BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions politics, including the academic boycott, a direction made easier as American Jewish oligarchs fund land grabs and implant enclave fortresses in East Jerusalem and on the West Bank. Some are naive, some are thoughtless, some can think of no other way to get the Israeli government's attention. Not many liberal American Jews go so far, but the gulf that has opened up between Israeli and American Jews will be a fundamental feature of the Jewish landscape for a long time. Obviously, Israeli politics is in an inflammable state, in no small part because Palestinian politics are dead-ended. The polarization in Israel-Palestine generates aftershocks in America, and we were in the throes of a nasty feedback loop. When the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations lays claim to speak for American Jews, and I note here that the Israeli philosopher Menachem Brinker has asked whether there are any minor Jewish organizations in America, it reveals itself helpless to resist the soft messianism and aggressive desperation of the West Bank occupation. The more the American Jewish establishment colludes with Netanyahu, the more damage the Israeli right does to the prospects for peace, and the more polarized are American Jews. As Israel becomes steadily more illiberal, it becomes more vexatious, more divisive for Jews who, all in all, remain, as I say, among America's most liberal populations. And the younger the Jews, the more so. I would expect then that minor Jewish organizations will proliferate. As a cement for American Jewish identity, the Holocaust is aging. The cracks will grow, and not over Israel, but over whether the Jews are really a people of values, and if so, which they are. Schmaltz, however marketed, will not hold together a fractious population whose two world centers, Israel and America, are increasingly irreconcilable. The people of values are once again tested to decide what their values are, which is where we came in. Thank you.
Bring the mic out. Okay, we're going to have a Q&A for a while, and our speaker, Todd Gitlin, will field the questions, and there will be a microphone passed around for you to ask. Thank you, Todd. You're in charge.
I was wondering if you might comment further on what you refer to as the Israeli occupation. I was wondering where this has been formally adjudicated in international forums, that it has been internationally adjudicated that Israel is an occupying power, and if in fact it has been adjudicated internationally, Do they suggest that Israel return the West Bank to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt?
I'm not a lawyer.
Well, you're using a legal term. Occupation is a formal legal term.
I am about to say something, sir. I have read legal articles in legal journals, defining occupation of a conquered territory and the limits imposed thereon by international law. There is no, I believe this is true, there is no nation on earth that recognizes the legality of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. In our book, The Chosen Peoples, Leibovitz and I quote the journalist Gershom Gorenberg, who recounts that the chief lawyer to the Israeli government, the Israeli foreign minister, later a law professor at NYU, declaring in a memo to the Labor government, civilian settlements on this territory are illegal. The only thing that is permissible under international law are temporary military establishments. This is a done deal. This is a finished story. There is no question about it. That's what my reading tells me, and I do not see any reason to alter my opinion.
It's always seemed to me that there's one of the lessons of the Holocaust that's part of the shared civil religion between Israel and America, at least for a period, as you were saying, up till the 60s and perhaps 70s, was that the answer to the Holocaust, the devastation of the Holocaust, was the redemption of the people in the form of the State of Israel, kind of a very much a salvation myth, as Jacob Neusner puts it. And I think that what we're seeing, I think what you're describing is that the myth, at least for Americans, younger Americans, is not holding up anymore. And yet it's such an unconscious myth amongst the older generation that they can't understand why the younger people are not going along with this. And therefore we had a generation where kind of the image of what it means to be a Jew, to be faithful to Israel and remember the Holocaust, was common to Israel and America, but today that's fraying. And I'm wondering where maybe you can project a little bit more your conclusion about the divergence between Israel and American Jews, particularly the younger generation, of whom very few are here.
One thing I learned in the 1960s and have subsequently often relearned as a scholar is that generations tend to disagree about things, especially historical things, because we enter into history at different moments. It's nobody's fault. It's the wheel turns, and people get on the train at different times. They get off the train at different times. So it shouldn't be surprising. I think the surprise that there is this cleavage among American Jews is occasioned by what seemed to be what appeared to be the strength of the sort of symbolic thinking that you described, where recovery and redemption, the miracle, the death and then the rebirth rang true, rang sensible. It was probably, I think, inevitable. I mean, we're not supposed to say such things, but I would say it was probably inevitable that, like every other phenomenon of history, however barbaric, however total in its significance at one time, has a shelf life as a living story. People come to think of it differently because more history happens in the interim. Again, this is a no-blame statement. And as is also so commonly the case when generations diverge by historical experience, they don't understand each other very well. Part of breaking with what came before is almost willfully misunderstanding. and the misunderstanding is mutual. Generational politics takes 2 generations to play. So there we are. So I think it's simply a matter of, so I think the propensity toward this cleavage has been in the works for quite some time. Now, that cleavage is partly a function of the erosion of some of the traditional forms of membership or kinds of family resemblance that American Jews, like other diaspora Jews, experience. I think the waning of them is the waning of those badges of identity is accelerated by what has taken place in Israel. I think Israel has changed more on this score than the United States, I don't think you have to be a fan of of socialist Zionism, let's say, of kibbutz life, to recognize that there was an idealism, there was an attempt to make the particular universal in Israel, which is virtually vanished. So even for those who were not socialists, this had some kind of, there was a sense of continuity between the settling of the land by Zionists and the original land. Well, that becomes harder to sustain. And because of the growing illiberality, in fact, I would go so far as to say the contempt displayed by the leaders of Jerusalem today for us, it can't help but be repaid in kind, because now what the more, shall we say, Trumpian of Netanyahu's supporters are effectively saying is, and I'm trying to remember the quote now, I can't remember the quote, but there was a former member of the cabinet, I believe, of the Netanyahu government who recently was quoted as saying something to the effect that the American Jews are, he used some derogatory term. They're just a bunch of little pishers or something like that, something of that weight. And I think Netanyahu's conduct when he came to Washington and gave the speech he did is yet another offense that, a symbolic offense that it registers with, especially with the young Jews who don't, however, even if they've been on a birthright trip and they have some feeling for the state of Israel, do not feel represented. They don't, and they're offended, in fact, when, as sometimes happens in American media, when Netanyahu is here, that he's treated as, and sometimes explicitly, as the leader of the Jewish people. So all of this is to say that I don't know where this is going, but I think it is a prerequisite for a different direction, that Israel's direction change, which I don't anticipate in forthcoming. So, by the way, I think, I'm not the scholar to do this, but I think we could probably find similar waves of estrangement generationally among other immigrant populations in America. I mean, I don't know much about it, but I know there have been, sort of generational cleavages among Cuban emigres, for example. Did you come in the aftermath of the Castro Revolution, or are now the children of them and say, enough already? I mean, the terms are inverted, but you see what I mean. So I think, again, this is structured into the dynamics of a homeland diaspora tension.
So you've spoken about the relationships between Jews in Israel and Jews in the U.S. I'm curious about what's going on within the Jews of Israel, well, within Israeli society right now. I'm wondering if you could comment on the recent Pew study that spoke of the cleavages within Israel.
Well, yeah, I've read at that study. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read the, as I say, executive summary, and I think it's very interesting. It needs to be plumbed, and I'm not an expert on Israeli opinion, but it made a number of things clear. This is a poll that just came out recently. You can all find it easily online. First of all, the Israeli Jews and American views are wildly divergent on a whole lot of value questions that go to sort of core American the question of whether core American liberalism has a place in Israeli life. So some of the issues on which that's being fought out in Israel are the question that came before the Knesset recently of whether Israeli NGOs or NGOs working in Israel who have funding from foreign governments must register as such. And there was even a proposal at one time that those who were receiving money from the US or any other government actually wear a badge that identified themselves when they were lobbying, which was viewed as too repulsive to pass. But my understanding is the law is still, has still passed. And the asymmetry here is very obvious to Israelis. I referred in passing to the American tycoons who buy up the land and expel Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and build the settlements and so on. Because they are private parties, not governments, they're not subject to these restrictions. Those who receive that American money from Irving Moskowitz, the bingo king of South Florida, who's a major funder of Israeli occupation activities, do not have to come out and say they are recipients of Mr. Moskowitz's largesse because he's not a government. Anyway, there are many such issues having to do with registration of people, freedom of speech, and so on. The Israeli political culture is becoming authoritarian. It's not completely authoritarian. It's a badly damaged democracy, and getting more so. Now, if certain events go badly in our country, we could go that way. I like to think it's not likely. But all this strikes to, I think, a sense of cultural difference. And by the way, there's one other striking thing in the Pew finding had to do with educational difference. American Jews, I can't remember the numbers now, but a large majority of American Jews have university degrees, and a plurality or a large bunch of them have postgraduate degrees. The Israeli population is not a highly educated population. So Israel is even a more unequal society than America because you have an upper crust, especially with tech, internet-related stuff. You have a thriving world-based economy, and then you have desperate poverty and people who can't afford housing and so on. I mean, obviously, these problems are not unfamiliar to us, but there seems to be an intensity of difference there. And as for you also asked about conflicts among Israeli Jews. I mean, there have been conflicts all along about religious questions. Clearly, because of the dynamics of population change, because the Orthodox children are more numerous, and secular Jews don't produce progeny, so secular Jews in Israel are diminishing as among young Jews, as is the case for non-Muslim populations in Europe, a similar dynamic. So there were all kinds of tensions all the time about whether religious Jews serve in the army and so on and so on. But I think what's most striking, but the political concept, I don't purport to understand why Israeli politics has gone so far to the right. I'm not really qualified to say, but sort of the liberal party in Israel has 5 seats in the Knesset, which is out of 120. So, and they're stuck there. Netanyahu is a very shrewd politician who's played this all very well. So the left is deeply demoralized, deeply frightened. Many people who've been active for a long time in Israeli politics, and I'm talking about sensible people, sort of the grandchildren of Martin Buber, if you will, beleaguered. When I visited East Jerusalem in 2010 with a woman named Hagit Ofran, who runs the Settlement Watch project of Peace Now. She gave me a tour around around an area called Silwan, which is just on the East Jerusalem side of the old city, and where she's a respected person. She's the granddaughter, by the way, of the great philosopher Leibovitz, Yehoshua Leibovitz. So she does that. She shows delegations around, sort of who owns what, and so on and so on, and what violations of UNESCO provisions and so on are being. And sometime later, Nazi accusations that she was a Nazi were scrawled on the wall in the stairwell of the building where she lives. I mean, that's the kind of thing that goes on there. So all in all, I think if you choose not to see that, if you're an American Jewish or other tourist going to Israel, you can get the Potemkin tour. But once you get out of that bubble and you poke around, you feel, I keep hearing this, you feel you are of these people, but you are not of the people as defined by the predominant spirit in that society.
Various Americans who were non-Jewish Jews, and I don't know if you were thinking of the Isaac Deutscher term, but
Yeah.
could you comment about Bernie Sanders in that
Yeah.
context?
I think Bernie Sanders has explicitly identified with that concept. He's called himself a non-Jewish Jew. Yes, this was, as you say, there's an essay by Isaac Deutscher, who was a Trotskyist historian, an interesting author of a terrific 3-volume biography of Trotsky. And I don't remember how Deutscher defined it, but Deutscher, who was a Polish Jew by origin, I believe, defined himself as that, meaning secular, primarily, let's just say secular. Now, Bernie, something like 22% of American Jews are non-Jewish Jews in the Bernie Sanders sense. That is, they would belong to my family resemblance concept. That is to say, they would say, I don't go to shul, but I eat matzah, or I go to a seder, or I don't always go to a seder, but I think I should go to a seder, or And if they're asked at a hospital, which has happened to me, religion, I don't know. I don't want to get into a big discussion. I don't believe in the Jewish God, but I always say Jewish. So, I mean, obviously this is this is, by the way, the growth of the non-Jewish Jews is of a piece, I believe, Claude Fisher would know more about this than I, with the sort of a general secularization in American society. Is that fair, more or less? Okay. So what to make of them? Some people were, it's kind of interesting, the reaction, there was a whole kerfuffle a few weeks ago when in some Jewish publications, Bernie Sanders was being criticized for not coming out with it. So at one point, he said something about how his father, was it his father or grandfather? Father was an immigrant from Poland. And then he was accused of evasiveness and so on. I mean, I thought it was much commotion about nothing. But how could anybody who listens to him for 5 minutes not know he was Jewish? No, but it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, what's interesting about the phenomenon is that it didn't come out as an issue. It has to be said. When Joe Lieberman was the vice presidential nominee, that wasn't much of an issue either in the press. So yeah, his wife's name is Hadassah. That's okay. That's interesting. and that was mentioned, but no, there was no big deal about it. I mean, so America, or at least much of America, or at least the left part of America, half, whatever, is, you know, okay with that and doesn't think much need to be said about it. I mean, if it happened that Bernie Sanders was elected president, it might be that somebody would be going after his birth certificate, you know, to ascertain that he really was born in Brooklyn or wherever it was, rather than having, you know, having come over from Poland or something. But I think, so, I mean, in other words, being that kind of Jew. I mean, the world of Seinfeld, you know, the world of Woody Allen, the world of, you know, of sort of the commonplaces of American Jews, especially in the professions, I think speaks for itself. It is not a big deal.
Sure. What I wanted to ask you about is, on the other side, is what do you make of the debating points in the Republican debates about U.S.-Israeli relations? I mean, there's nuance there, but I think it's pretty interesting what they've had to say.
You'll have to remind me, because I couldn't watch all of them.
Mr. Trump suggested
I know
that,
it came up, but I can't
sure,
remember them.
well, that Mr. Trump suggested that the thing to do was to be neutral enough to try and make a deal.
Oh, right.
And
So
that the others said, no, we have to stand foursquare with Israel, right or wrong. And so, you know, I think that's pretty interesting, the way that that debate is going. So I wondered what you thought of that.
Right. Well, the mainstream of the Republican Party, by which they're now running from the Bushes over through Ted Cruz, for all their differences, are more, you know, are more Zionist than the Jews. I mean, I have no view about what they authentically believe, if that even means anything, but certainly a very large part of their constituency. No, I mean, I'm serious. I mean, in politics, you never really know. But what is certainly the case is that a very large portion of their base is more Zionist than the Jews. So Trump, I don't know what he was thinking, or if he was thinking when he came on with his statement about getting them to make a deal. I mean, that seems to be, that's his general that's one of his performance notes whenever he runs into something that might require more than a one-phrase answer. He says, well, I'm a great deal maker, and I'll, you know, don't worry about it. Believe me. So I don't take that awfully seriously, or although one could say that it was a wink and a nod at David Duke and his friends, or, you know, it's beyond me. All I know is that, am I right, by the way, that this hasn't come up in the Democratic debates? Which I didn't watch all of either, but.
I think basically that's right. I think basically that's right.
I mean, at this point, I mean, I never would have thought this would be the case 15 years ago, but at this point, the Republican Party is so deeply vermished, as my grandmother would say, that conceivably anything might turn into a significant cleavage for them. And there may well be, just as, you know, it was, you know, the closest the left wing of Israel ever came to having recognition from an American administration was from James Baker, far more so than under any Democratic Secretary of State. So they may still be the old sort of James Baker Republicans may still be around. I don't know, maybe not. But I do think that I don't think it'll be. I mean, both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and any conceivable Democratic candidate for, you know, the next generation will say essentially the same things. They'll say, you know, Israel is our closest ally, and everybody should settle down and end the conflict, and then probably not do very much about it, you know. So, but with Trump, you don't know.
Over here. Thanks for your talk. Question about American Jews and the formation of their identity, both, let's say, ethnic and religious, to just take two components. How do you see that relating to, in general, in this country, what's happening with ethnic identity and what's happening with religiosity or religious identity? Are we a cork floating on a much larger ocean of people? Is our story unique in that regard?
You mean the attempt to clarify, or if you like, rigidify the boundary about, who are the real X population?
Well, you were talking about, for instance, how ethnic identity is diminishing generationally. Like
That is generally the finding of ethnic groups in America.
Yeah, and how about religious identity, like in terms of a religious revival nationally, a religious revival within Judaism?
I yield to my former colleague, but my impression is that religious affiliation has been declining for a generation or so, at least. Thank you. I got that right. Yeah, I mean, the power of American secularism, or whatever we want to call it, the not quite melting pot, is very great. It's very great. So, I studied this 20 years ago, so my recollection is all is old. But I remember that the figures. For example, here's some figures I remember. The two ethnic groups that intermarry the most in America, this was true 20 years ago, were Jews and Asians. I'd be surprised if that weren't still the case. What I remember from looking at Hispanics is that the longer they stay and the more generations arrive, the less likely they are to speak Spanish at home, let alone in public. And they become less Hispanic but in the same way that the Jews become less Jewish. So they have foods, they have tradition, Cinco de Mayo, they have their equivalent of the bar mitzvah, or bat mitzvah, the quinceañera celebration, and so on. But and of course, for Mexicans, it's somewhat easier because you can continue a relationship with the home country, at least until the wall is built. With greater ease. But that does seem to be the American story in general. And Herb Gans, my colleague at Columbia, who wrote some of the early work on what he called symbolic ethnicity, which had to do with people going to a few holiday celebrations and eating certain kind of food and so on. His concern, he agreed that this was the general tendency toward acculturation of ethnic groups, and that it was also manifest also in intermarriage and other kinds of social interaction. But the big exception, he said, was African Americans. And his concern, we were discussing this when I was writing a book about this, and he read the manuscript, and he said his concern was that that sort of the way America was going, the key cleavage was going to be not between white and color, but between black and non-black. And I think there's something to be said for that scenario. Adam, did we have a mic up here?
I have
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll get it down to you.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
You might regret that.
I'm an old.
Hi.
No, I'm not quitting.
Jane Falk. I'm Candace's right-wing Zionist zealot sister. I think you know Candace. Did I understand correctly that you were implying that the occupation, so-called occupation, was motivated by a sense of chosenness? That is a kind of arrogance. I just want to say that that's a kind of outside, I can see that as a kind of Gentile outside point of view, but not as as nobody, not even Netanyahu, would say, we're the chosen people, therefore we're entitled to this land. I mean, the motivation for the occupation has to do with economic, military, historical, religious, but not chosen motives. So that's part one. Should I wait for you to,
Yeah,
or
if you
should
would.
I?
My co-author of the book we talked about, The Chosen Peoples, is an Israeli. I owe principally to him the sort of excavation for the land-based, the religious thread within the a-religious movement Zionism. There is a sense, even on the part of the settlers who were secular themselves and labor-minded, that this was, after all, the real Israel. After all, biblical Israel was not in Tel Aviv. It was Samaria, Judea and Samaria.
That's right, but that's different than being chosen. Then we're entitled to it because we're chosen.
No, I don't say that. I mean, that's what it takes me a lot of pages. It takes the two of us a lot of pages in the book to spell out what we mean, and I don't want to over-distort. Of course there are security concerns. Of course there are security concerns. When you occupy a territory for almost 50 years, where several million people are displaced and mistreated, you're going to have security concerns. You would always have security concerns. But the security concerns that now afflict Israel, which I do not dismiss in the slightest, real, very real, but I think they have there is a subtext which is of religious dimension. And this is why ever since Menachem Begin, though the occupied territories have been called Judea and Samaria. Those are not names they picked out of a guide to the security of a modern nation state.
Religious doesn't mean that it comes from the part of the religion that says that we are the chosen people. That's a separate thing from...
There were more steps involved.
Yeah, okay, but being the chosen people...
Okay, but if I may, and I want to hear your second question, but if I may, if the majority, if the Israeli government today were not so attached to the transcendent meaning of that territory, then I could walk in there with Donald Trump and make a deal. Because there are actually rational questions, rational disputes about land and water and so on, and and security. These are genuine issues. And people make deals about, vexing and sometimes brutal, ruthless quarrels that have gone on for decades, and they still make deals. It's when it's holy ground. I mean, why did Serbia go to war to retain Kosovo?
Not because they were chosen.
No, because Serbia claimed that the origin of the Serbian people was in Kosovo. It had to do with a war they won in the 13th century. So it's not only Jews that...
Okay.
I'm sorry, but you...
Todd, what are your thoughts about BDS? Is it justified? Could it be effective in pressuring Israel? And what about the distinctions between different types of boycott, divestment, sanctions, academic, non-academic? I know you wrote something on this in Tablet recently.
Good, yeah. So the easy part first. The B part, boycott, when it comes to academic life, I think is completely indefensible on general grounds. Some people say, well, there was, in the case when we were all working against apartheid in South Africa, evidently there were some British academics who declared an academic boycott. The issue never came up here. I don't remember it ever coming up. I was very involved in that campaign. And so I don't think, I think it's always a bad idea to impose an academic boycott. It's also so stupid and insulting because the academics in Israel are the most peace-minded of the population. So it's a direct offense to them. And by the way, I've debated BDS representatives. They are extremely dishonest in the claims they make for it. For example, one thing they say is, well, it's not we're not for boycotting particular professors. We're for boycotting institutions. Well, as it happens, if Israeli professors are paid poorly, and one of the benefits they get is a subsidized trip out of the country to do research. So if you're boycotting the institution which is granting that stipend, then you're inflicting harm upon Israeli scholars. So that to me is a no-brainer. Sanctions. Well, let me deal with divestment first. I have no trouble either with boycott or sanctions directed against economic activity in the territories. Now, actually, Peter Beinart has described that position as Zionist BDS. I just offer that. I don't know. It's not a particular term I would use, but what he means is that it is right to trade or invest in Israel as you would with any other nation, but since this is illicit occupation, if you know that a company is conducting business primarily on the West Bank, and I suppose it might even go so far as is integrally involved in maintaining. So, for example, if it happened, if one knew, as you may know, Israel is building a two-tier road system in the West Bank. There are Jewish roads and there are Arab roads. If there is a particular company that's involved in building those segregated roads, I personally don't want to invest in that company or deal with it. I think that's wrong. Here's the hard part, and you touched on it in your question, because the defenders of BDS, including people who don't like, let me back up for a minute. There's a lot of dishonesty in the BDS part. So if you look at their three cardinal principles, one of them, until very recently, they changed the language because there was a deliberate ambiguity. They said, we're against the colonial occupation. But they didn't specify that they meant the West Bank. So, and it was for a reason, because the leadership is actually against the existence of a Jewish state. So they changed the language, but they didn't change the rest of the setup. So it does, I talked about this in that recent article, that if you look at the rest of this stuff, it no longer fits with the revision, because obviously they're trying to patch it up because some people don't like it. But there's also a provision there, we're for the right of return in accordance with UN resolution number something or other. Well, it's not a good argument. I mean, I've read the resolution. It's one of many resolutions. They cherry-picked the resolution they like. So it's a resolution that was passed in the middle of the 1948 war, and it doesn't really apply. I'm not here to settle the question of what would be a just right of return, but in any case, it ain't as simple as they say. So I don't like these oversimplifications. That said, and I've had this discussion recently with a friend who's Israeli and whose politics are very similar to mine, she actually is softer on BDS than I am because of the point you made, that however imprecise or worse, however sloppy, however intellectually dishonest or corrupted it is actually affecting Israeli policy. Now, here I would still disagree with her for the following reason. I'm aware, by the way, when that time when I was in Israel in 2010, I heard Shimon Peres express very vigorous fear of impending European boycotts and sanctions. And as you probably know, the EU has now required the labeling of products from the settlements as a separate. They can't say any longer legally made in Israel or shipped from Israel. I still think it's a bad idea to the universal boycott, divestment, sanctions, because I think it only makes the Israeli right crazier. Now these are difficult judgments. I don't think that argument is crazy. I don't think it's indecent. I think it's ill thought, but partly for the definitional reasons which I mentioned, but also because the Israeli right has pulled the population along with it to a considerable degree, because the new form of chosenness, I mean, this is another direction to go in from this talk, which I didn't get into, is the feeling, is the Israeli defensiveness. The world is now choosing us, all right, and they're choosing us to boycott when they're not boycotting Chinese universities or Russian this or what have you. I mean, there are a lot of bad actors among nations that we trade with and so on. I mean, I think there are counter arguments to that too, and I do think the United States does have a direct an obligation, curiously enough, to be firm on Israel and to punish it for violations of American law, in part, in no small part, because we fund it. And Israel is the largest, I believe, the largest recipients of aid. Now that also turns out to be a very complicated business, because almost all of that aid is military. Almost all of it. I mean, I've looked. The amount of strictly economic aid is minuscule. So then you have to look at the military aid and say, well, is this, because I think America should provide military aid to Israel, but it's some military aid for specifically defensive purposes. So that's a hard line to draw, and I think it's a line that should be explored. And I wish that the people who support BDS for the right reasons or are open to it, not because they want to drive the Jews into the sea or end the state of Israel or something like that, but because they are genuinely angry, as I am, at Israeli policy. I think it would be good if they would explore forms of proposal that people like me could support. And I'm open to them.
Well, I think we'll have to close it now, and thank you very much. I'm sure we could go on for quite a while, but thank you, Todd, for stimulating this discussion. Thank you. And thank you all for attending.